Thought Leadership from PwC's National Office.
Hello, I'm Diana Stoltzfus, and welcome back to PwC's Accounting Podcast. This is Sustainability Now. I'm especially looking forward to today's episode because we're taking a closer look at one of the most important developments shaping corporate climate reporting, the modernization of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. With me today is Paul Munter, member of the GHG Protocol's International Standards Board and former SEC Chief Accountant. Paul brings a unique perspective on how standard setters, regulators, and companies are working together to strengthen consistency and trust in the greenhouse gas reporting. Before we get started, just a quick note, if you'd like to watch a video of this conversation, you'll find a link in our show notes. Well, thank you, Paul, so much for joining me today. I'm so happy to have you on the podcast.
Pleasure to be with you. Looking forward to the discussion, Diana.
Great. So the Greenhouse Gas Protocol has been around for decades, but recently it's entered a major period of modernization with a new governance structure, technical working groups working to modernize the standards, maintaining the standards. So can you just give us, maybe taking a step back, what's the current landscape with the GHG Protocol and why are these updates getting so much attention?
Yeah, it's a terrific question. And as you say, the GHG Protocol itself has been around for 2+ decades, and the standards themselves are anywhere from 10 to 20 years old. And if you think back to, you go back to 10, 15 years ago, you had the GHG Protocol standards themselves, but they kind of were in a bit of a vacuum, right? There weren't these other reporting frameworks in place in various places around the world and the like. And then secondly, there's obviously been a lot of developments on the scientific front.
Sure.
In terms of what could be measured, how they're being measured, and I'll call them technological changes in terms of like how the power grids operate and forms of renewable energy and all of that. And so as all of these things are kind of coming together, there's a need to make sure that the GHG Protocol standards work with the other frameworks, because many of them are kind of anchored in the GHG Protocol measurement and reporting framework. Right. So make sure that there's what you hear referred to as interoperability, but then also that it's scientifically sound, it reflects the marketplaces in which companies are operating, and also can serve as continue to serve as a sound basis where companies are putting in their own plans, and they have specific targets that they're aiming to achieve as they work to decarbonize, and make sure that those are reflective of scientific achievements that are available to companies.
Right. Yeah, it makes me think about, we think about financial reporting. Financial reporting has been around, maybe modern financial reporting, 100+ years. And you think about all the time and developments. And then we could think about sustainability reporting and specifically the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. You have to keep pace with all that change. So Paul, as a member of GHG Protocol's International Standards Board, can you start by explaining the board's role and how it fits into the GHG Protocol's new governance model?
Yeah, happy to. And I guess I should note here that while I am a member of the Independent Standards Board of the GHG Protocol, I'm not here on behalf of the protocol. I'm not speaking on behalf of them. I'm here just in my individual capacity. But the GHG Protocol updated its governance structure a year and a half ago, give or take. And so the way the standards are developed is you have obviously the Secretariat and people at the Secretariat are leading the development of it, but being supported by technical working groups. And so there are a number of technical working groups to support each of the various projects. The Independent Standards Board is responsible for ultimately approval of the work streams, the membership of the technical working groups, the conclusions that come out of those, et cetera. And then you have a steering committee on top of that that's responsible for ratifying the work of the Independent Standards Board that's bubbling up from the technical working group. So it's a kind of a multi-step process And it's designed to ensure, one, that the standards are grounded in scientific integrity. Secondly, that they also reflect, I'll call it a degree of pragmatism, because ultimately they have to be applied. And,
Right.
and is information available and the like that companies can get their arms around.
Right.
And as I was mentioning a moment ago, how is it they're going to interrelate with other frameworks and the like to achieve the goal of having standards that are providing meaningful measurements that actually can drive improvements in climate behavior, because it's an interesting objective to have not only an important reporting framework, but also designed to try to drive improvements in managing climate risk and trying to reduce emissions that obviously affect all of us.
Right. It's interesting with sustainability reporting and greenhouse gas reporting. It has a slightly different objective too than when we think about traditional financial reporting as well. This driving behavior that you're highlighting.
And you're right, Dana. That's really an important difference, and something I have to remind myself of, because if you think about like what FASB is doing,
right.
Their objective is not to drive a particular behavior. Right? Their objective is that whatever the behavior is, that be reflected fairly and in an unbiased fashion
right.
in the finance statements, whereas here you do have an element of the process that is designed to try to drive behavioral changes as well.
Right, right. And a lot of this with target setting, if companies have done that, which I know you mentioned in your intro. So maybe building on that a little bit, Paul, you have a unique perspective too with your career experience with the intersection of accounting, assurance, public policy. What drew you to this role, and how do you think that impacts your perspectives?
Yeah, really good question. So when I retired from the SEC a few months back, I took a bit of time just kind of thinking about what else did I want to do, and candidly spent a lot of time saying no to things.
Always a good problem to have, though, Paul.
Yeah, indeed. And I've gotten much better at saying no and not feeling bad about it than I was in the past. And at the same time, the GHG Protocol was still in the process of building out the Independent Standards Board. And so I had an opportunity to become part of it. I first spent some time educating me on the governance structure and the process and the like, and kind of where were they in their standards setting development, which we'll get more into. And asking myself, well, are there things that I can actually bring to the table? And as you say, I've got a lot of experience dealing with standard setting, regulatory rulemaking, assurance over information and the like. So there are certainly aspects of my background where I can be very helpful to their process and ensuring that they have a consultative process that allows for feedback to come in and consideration of that feedback and development of high quality standards. Now, candidly, there are other aspects, particularly in some of the scientific stuff that we get into, where I have to rely much more on the scientific experts.
Sure.
But in terms of process and understanding what it takes to develop a high quality standard that you can get, I'll call it buy-in, but you get acceptance of, which is really critical. I do think I have a lot of experience that are beneficial.
That's great. Well, maybe we'll dive in now to some of the projects. So maybe starting the Scope 2 guidance. I think we're recording this on October 21st. I think yesterday, October 20th, was when it was released out for public consultation. So this is the first major project under the ISB's oversight. Maybe from your perspective or the board's perspective, what are some of the key issues under consideration as these revisions are going through this consultation?
Yeah, and as you say, when we're recording this, it was just released. The comment period runs till December 19th, I think it is. And as we're just saying, any and all feedback is more than welcome, for sure, to help improve the process and the like. There are kind of several things, at least to my way of thinking, and again, this is kind of my view, that I think are really important in terms of the Scope 2 guidance. One is the question of boundaries. So in the existing standards, you've got these choices of boundaries, whether you base it on what's labeled financial control or operational control, and even in financial control, you've got a choice of how you deal with affiliates and the like. And so that creates a challenge in terms of comparability when you've got different perspectives on what it is you're actually trying to capture within your sustainability inventory. So I think trying to provide better guidance that will enhance consistency, I think will be very helpful, and to the extent that it can achieve greater alignment with what financial reporting, I think is, at least to me, intuitively easier to understand. If you say you're really talking about the same entity, for lack of a better description, whether you're talking about emissions data or you're talking about financial statements or what have you. So I think that's one key aspect of it that I know I've personally spent a lot of time working on and understanding and providing input on. Then of course you've got the difference between the location-based measurement versus the market-based measurement, and I think that's really important, and I think is reflective of how particularly electricity markets have evolved over time. And again, sources of power generation, including obviously renewables and the like, that if you go back to when these standards were developed, were very different. But it also is trying to be mindful of the fact that the energy market doesn't function the same way everywhere around the world. So the way our power grid works in the U.S. Is very different than the way it works in other jurisdictions. And so you have to be understanding of that, so that the measurements are reflective of actual power usage, the source of the power itself, the degree to which companies have alternatives that they can seek out and the like. So I think that's another really important aspect of this. And then beyond that, of course, the question of well, what do you capture, and should there be exemptions, and if so, what do those exemptions look like? And again, personally, that's an area I'm really interested in the feedback on. I'll show you my bias. I'm not a huge fan of exemptions in any reporting. In any respect, So I'm a little bit biased, but I'm certainly wanting to hear, what are other perspectives, and I understand, why the exemptions are being proposed, but are they the right ones? Are they going to provide meaningful information and the like? So I think that's another very important aspect of it. And then you have to look at this in the context of kind of the broader work stream, where you've got the other consultations that will be coming later on, and then you've got the development of guidance that will come after that, all of which are obviously important. So are there areas where the GHG Protocol should be thinking about developing more guidance in this area or that? And I think that's another area where feedback can be really helpful in allowing the GHG Protocol to modernize its standards and do it in a way that can achieve greater consistency and comparability, and again, interoperability with whether it's ISSB or ESRS or what's going on elsewhere, to again kind of have a package of sustainability reporting that is informative to whatever the relevant constituents are that are going to be consuming that and making decisions in part based on that information.
We've talked about feedback a number of times, and I think maybe to one of the points that you're bringing too, sometimes when we think about sustainability reporting and greenhouse gas reporting, it's a wider view than maybe what we typically think of when we think of financial reporting, where we're typically focused kind of on investors, people making credit decisions, that type of thing, whereas when you get into greenhouse gas reporting and these other sustainability frameworks, the stakeholders get much broader. People, society, different groups within those. And so as the ISB is thinking about this, and you've mentioned the importance of stakeholder feedback, how how do you make sure that you're getting that quality feedback?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and obviously some of it is just here's the document out there, right. Come one, come all, respond. But some of it, you're right. You have to be more proactive and do outreach to make sure that you are getting input from, as many, not just as many in total, but as many different stakeholders as you possibly can. I'm thinking back to experiences that you and I shared a bit at the SEC in work on the climate proposal, where the commission got tens of thousands of comment letters. But even within that, it's trying to make sure, well, okay, where did they come from? And you've got obviously some from preparers, some from investors. Some from regulators, et cetera. And to your point, you need to think about it a bit more broadly, because we're not just focused on information that's going to be a decision useful for investors.
Right.
Some of it is, as we're talking about, the objective is to try to drive behaviors. Well, so how might management think about this in terms of the targets and goals that they're setting and the time horizon that they're going to put in place to achieve those targets and goals? To what degree does it facilitate voluntary adoption in advance of any kind of mandated reporting framework, for example? How does it interrelate with reporting frameworks in different jurisdictions? Because there's going to be, well, there are today, but there are even more so in the future, companies that find themselves subject to multiple reporting frameworks, and how do those things interplay with one another? So it's really trying to sit back and think about it holistically, and evaluate whether the input that has come in does kind of represent the entire spectrum of key stakeholders. And I guess I would say, there's no such thing as too much feedback.
Right.
And like I say, you can go back to the SEC experience, even though it literally was tens of thousands of comment letters, and spent a lot of time reading, evaluating, what have you. And obviously, some of it's going to be supportive, some of it's not, some of it's kind of, in between. But there's absolutely no such thing as too much feedback. All feedback, regardless of whether it's supportive or not, or suggestions, is very valuable to developing a high quality product.
Right. Well, one other thing that we've touched on now a couple of times that you've mentioned is interoperability. So as you said, we have the ISSB disclosure standards out there. We have the ESRS, the European Sustainability Reporting Standards. And both of those have the GHG Protocol, as mentioned, both those standards, and form the basis, I would say, for their GHG emissions disclosures. But I think as maybe we've talked around a little bit, there are still some slight differences between those standards. How does the GHG Protocol think about interoperability between at least these major frameworks? And to your point, there's even reporting in other jurisdictions that varies as well.
It's an important part of the thought process. And to that regard, you have the members of the Independent Standards Board that we're talking about earlier, but then you have a number of observers that participate in the meetings and get to bring their perspectives and the like when it comes time to vote. Limited to the members of the ISB, but you've got the ISSB is an observer. EFRAG is an observer from Europe. You've got these groups that are, I guess you call them information repositories, right? It's like SBTI, for example, and CDP that are. In some respects, are data accumulators that become really very helpful sources of information in terms of what's going on in the marketplace, what can and can't be captured, and the like, that help the GHG Protocol think through, where do you have to make practical cuts on things and still have meaningful information. So that becomes a really important part of the process. Now you can't be, completely beholden to one particular view or another, but you need to be informed about, if you make this decision, what does that do to interoperability?
Right.
It's kind of like When you're thinking about like financial reporting questions that come up and you're doing consultation, you always want to know whether those kinds of questions have been answered before, and if so, what the answer is. You might or might not land in the same place. We need to understand
what was the historical
how is it going to interplay, right?
Yeah.
So same kind of thing here is you got to understand how will it interplay with these other frameworks. And you've got, in addition to ISSB and FREG, you've got things like CARB going on, of course.
Yes. The California Air Resource Board, which is the
you.
California
regulations. Yes. And you've got other jurisdictions that are adopting their own frameworks, many of which are, somewhat aligned with ISSB, but with important differences here and there, particularly on things like Scope 3, where you're starting to see some of these differences arise as well. So understanding that becomes really important because, as you mentioned a moment ago, the measurements, Scope 1, 2, and 3 are really the foundation for most, if not all, of these other reporting frameworks. So it becomes really important to make sure that you've got frameworks that can be operationalized, can be measured and reported on a consistent basis, and can reflect real substantive differences in terms of how emissions are working in one jurisdiction versus another.
Right. All really important points. Well, maybe, Paul, you mentioned, Scope 1, where we've talked about the Scope 2 project, and we have Scope 3. So, as you've mentioned, beyond Scope 2, they're going to update the corporate standard. They're going to update the Scope 3 standard. What kind of clarifications or changes can you highlight there for us?
So, again, this goes back to the fact these standards have been around quite a while, right? So, I think there's kind of three categories of things that are kind of under consideration. One is there's clearly been scientific developments in 10, 15, 20 years. And so, you think about it from the standpoint of, well, you want to use the best measurement attributes available. And what might be the best measurement attributes today might look very different than what they looked like 10, 15 years ago. In part because of scientific advancements, and also in part in terms of how the market mechanisms are actually working. So it's trying to provide guidance on that, number one. Number two is acknowledging the fact that interoperability is far more important than it was back then.
Right, because more and more companies are having to report under these multiple regimes.
Exactly. So how does that fit into the broader landscape, and trying to get feedback on that? And then the third is, well, even if you understand I'll call it the basic metrics and how the market works, is, well, you probably really need some additional guidance on the reporting itself. Just to make sure there's clarity. So, for example, you might have two companies that have targets that they want to achieve. One might be achieving it through actual movement to more renewable energy as a way to achieve the target. The other might be trying to achieve it mostly through environmental credit offsets as their mechanism. And I'm not here to say one's better or not, but those are different approaches to trying to achieve decarbonization, and making sure that whatever the approach is that management is taking, that there is transparency, that the stakeholders can understand and be able to evaluate.
Right. I think that's critically important. Maybe one thing that we haven't touched on yet, Paul, is what is the timeline for all these projects?
So as you said, the Scope 2 is out for consultation now. The corporate standards and the Scope 3, the objective is to get those out for consultation early in 2026, with, again, a roughly same time frame, a couple months period for comments to try to push those forward to completion. Now, one of the big questions that is at play and you were telling me you were looking at all the questions.
Yes,
and
there's
the like.
lots of questions.
Lots of questions. But one is questions about transition. How long should the transition period be? What kind of accommodations should there be to facilitate transition and the like? And so that's going to be a really important consideration if the protocol is able to achieve this timeline. There's still the huge question of, okay, so when do we think that ought to go live, and what do we think that should look like, and should everybody go at the same time, or should it be like in a lot of regulatory, it's bigger companies first and then smaller companies. So those are, I think, really important pieces to the puzzle that will need to be answered. And that's, again, another area where feedback is going to be immensely important.
Right. And companies will have to think about how that impacts their targets and other information that they've reported historically. So again, to your point, there's so many considerations, not just one, but there'll be a lot.
And it's all of this interrelates, because when you think about scope 3, it's not just you, but it cascades through your value chain.
Right.
So as you think about phased adoption, well, what does that do to your ability to get information that will allow you to be able to measure scope 3?
Yeah.
And inevitably what that means is the quality of the information inevitably will improve over time.
Yep.
Because you're going to have to be relying probably more on estimation early on as the standards kind of cascade throughout your value chain.
Yeah, that's a great point. So maybe staying on that point a little bit, Paul, what should companies be doing now to think about these potential changes?
So I think a couple of things. Obviously, want to encourage folks to think about responding and providing input first and foremost. So I think that would be really useful. And inevitably, as companies themselves start to think about it, they'll think about their own processes and where are areas where we might need to put processes in place. You don't want to actually go lock stuff down yet based on proposals, of course, but you need to start thinking about it and what kind of data we'll need to capture and where might that data come from and the like. And I think the other thing to think about is how does it relate with the target goal setting and management of your strategy, but also how does it fit with your broader corporate reporting strategy? While again the objectives are a little different than they are for financial reporting, it's still important that companies at the end of the day are going to be telling a consistent story, whether it's in the financial statements or the annual report or it's in these other communication documents. So who is it that's going to have responsibility for it? How will those, whoever that is, interact with the finance team and those kind of things to make sure that you do have a consistent approach to how you're trying to manage climate risk and communicate your management of the climate risk.
So Paul, as I've gotten more involved in sustainability reporting, we've seen a shift to where sustainability reporting used to be more disconnected, I would say, from the finance function as we've seen, and we're seeing it come together a little bit more. I think a lot of that is driven by more of this coming under required regulatory reporting. Sustainability reporting is continuing to mature, as we've touched on. So how do you think about how finance teams and sustainability teams can work together more effectively?
Yeah, so I think it's exactly what you're describing is you have to make sure that you're working together. Now, who has ownership of it certainly can differ depending upon the org structure and approach to risk management and the like. But they have to be in close concert with one another so that they understand, what one is trying to do and what the objectives are, and they understand terminology. I mean, I can recall a conversation I had, and this was, a few years back when I was still at the SEC, and I was in a meeting with some audit committee members, and they were talking about the company's sustainability reporting and using terms like commitment, right?
Yeah.
and you start getting into the conversations, and they would say, well, we don't really mean commitment in the same way we mean it in the finance statement. It's really more aspirational. Well, the words
matter.
Words are really important. And so again, making sure that you're communicating the same message throughout your different communication channels. So I don't think it's critical necessarily that finance have ownership of that, but you do have to have a lot of communication and engagement between them so that you are telling the same story. The other thing, I'm kind of reminded of a statement we did when we were both at the SEC, and it was a statement about the approach to risk management, right? And how that needs to interplay with, in particular, we're talking about financial reporting, but you can't view risk management in a silo here and reporting there. That you got to have an overall approach to risk management, and you can't think about just this piece of risk and this piece of risk. You got to have an overall strategy for risk management. So if you're talking about your management of climate risk, well, how does that fit in with your other strategic goals and objectives and the like? So I think that all has to integrate within the company's risk management processes.
And when we think about this too, when companies are disclosing what is their strategy to address many of these climate risks, it might be entering into new products, making significant capital investments, all these things which ultimately would be part of your financial statements.
Yeah, absolutely.
So maybe as we're talking about this integration and thinking about, I would say, kind of broadly governance too, how do you think about the role of boards and audit committees in overseeing emissions reporting?
Good question. And one of the things that you see is in some organizations, whatever's new, that gets dumped on the audit committee's agenda, right?
Yeah.
And it may or may not make sense. I think it depends upon, one, what's the regulatory environment, which is different from one jurisdiction to another. It certainly depends upon how the company's risk management processes work, and how do those flow up to the board. And I'll just call it the general approach to governance. So I think there's not a one size fits all, definitely, but those things have to mesh together. So there has to be a governance process, so that whether it's the board or the audit committee or maybe it's the risk committee or some
other
combination of those, that at the governance level they understand what is management's approach to risk and management, identification and management of risks. How does management see these various functions interrelating, and how does that flow into corporate reporting broadly, and making sure that there is connectivity within the organization. And when you get into governance and you deal a lot with governance issues, you have to be very careful when you're in a governance position that there's a difference between oversight and responsibility for doing it. And oversight cannot be just passive either. So there has to be a proactive element, but that means understanding what the process is, evaluating whether that process makes sense for where the company is and where it's trying to go, and obviously providing input for improvements to the process. And I think those are really key parts of governance responsibility here.
Yeah. Well, Paul, this has been great. We've covered a lot today, so maybe just a couple last questions. Maybe looking ahead, what does success look like for the ISB and the GHG Protocol over the next few years?
So I think obviously completing these projects and developing high quality standards that can serve as the foundation going forward for these other reporting frameworks and information repositories is very critical. I think beyond that, there will be a need for additional guidance as markets evolve and the like. And then I think the other couple of things, there's a couple of other work streams that are in earlier stage dealing with land use and the like, and there's obviously a lot of scientific development going on there, whether it's just land use itself or forestation and the like, that are really important to kind of fitting into the broader picture of decarbonization strategies. So I think there's a lot to do, not just in terms of finalizing this suite of standards, but to supporting the reporting on an ongoing basis, to being responsive to scientific developments, including some of these other aspects that I think are going to be important to having a fair depiction of what a company's climate strategy is actually going to do to help achieve decarbonization objectives.
Right, making sure that they have a comprehensive reporting around it.
Right.
Very interesting. Well, any final thoughts, Paul, as we wrap up here today?
Other than just to reiterate a couple of messages, more input is better.
Yes.
So certainly welcome input. Looking forward to seeing the response that we get to the current proposal and to the proposals coming after that. Certainly looking forward to the opportunity to continue to contribute to the process. I've learned a lot and am enjoying that and getting into some of the other areas that I was kind of on the periphery before. It has been very enjoyable, but also thinking about, again, how do all of these pieces fit together so that consumers of information can kind of understand the entire picture, and as companies are telling their story, they can tell the entire story in a cohesive and transparent way.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much, Paul, today for sharing your insights and what's going on at the ISB, and it was great talking with you.
Thanks, Dana. Great to be with you.